I'm Nima Rajan. Canada's Defence Department says the C-17 military transport planes flying into Afghanistan have been upgraded to help get more Afghans out of harm's way. Spokeswoman Jessica Lamarand says the flights will carry foreign and Afghan nationals who have been accepted under the immigration programs of other nations. The effort to get former Afghan interpreters and their families out of Afghanistan is gathering momentum. This comes in the face of complaints about roadblocks in Kabul and bureaucratic hurdles in Ottawa. The Conservative, Liberal and NDP leaders talked about health care funding as they campaigned in key ridings across the country yesterday. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole promised to increase federal funding for provincially run health care systems by 6% per year or more if the economy grows faster than expected. Appearing in Victoria, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau outlined plans to improve wages and conditions in long-term care facilities and said his government would increase provincial transfers. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh campaigned in Edmonton and promised a $250 million fund to help train and hire 2,000 nurses. The United States extended restrictions on non-essential travel at land and ferry border crossings until September 21st. It is the first such extension since Canada opened the border to vaccinated Americans earlier in the month. Canada currently allows U.S. citizens and permanent residents into the country, provided they have been fully vaccinated against COVID-19. The U.S. does allow Canadians to fly across the border for non-essential purposes. Chief Stuart Phillip of BC's Penticton Indian Band says the lack of progress on many of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action is a clear example of how the federal Liberals didn't deliver on their promises to Indigenous peoples. Chief Phillip says Indigenous people have certain fundamental priorities that must be addressed during the current election campaign. They include the climate crisis, implementing the Truth and Reconciliation and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Committee's calls to action, and also ending drinking water advisories. B'nai B'rith Canada says it has seen a rise in anti-Semitic vandalism since the federal election campaign started on Sunday. CEO Michael Mostyn says the Beth Shalom Synagogue in Midtown Toronto was defaced with a swastika, as were the campaign signs of two Jewish MPs running for re-election in Montreal. This also included a school in a Jewish neighborhood in Thornhill, Ontario. Police in Toronto, Montreal, and York Region are investigating. An Ottawa-based Muslim charity is asking a court to freeze a federal suspension prohibiting it from issuing tax receipts. This while a challenge of the penalty plays out. Officials for Human Concern International say a one-year suspension levied last month will cause irreparable harm to the organization and thousands of beneficiaries. The Canada Revenue Agency accused the charity of improperly issuing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of donation receipts on behalf of organizations administering 6 initiatives, a practice known as third-party receipting. A new survey suggests a majority of Canadians support a system that would require proof of vaccination to access some non-essential services. According to the poll conducted by Leger, 76% of respondents say they would strongly or somewhat strongly support a vaccine passport like the one Quebec is implementing. Its passport will apply in places like bars, concerts, and festivals where there are lots of people in a confined space. A survey of small and medium-sized businesses by KPMG finds 62% are already implementing mandatory workplace vaccinations or have plans to. 84% believe COVID-19 vaccines are crucial to avoiding another lockdown, and that certain places or jobs should require vaccine passports. KPMG is advising companies to get legal advice first. DFO says about 70 lobster traps are being held at its facilities after seizures in the areas where the Sabaga-Nagadi First Nation have been operating a self-regulated fishery. The news comes after Chief Mike Sack was arrested and questioned Monday by fisheries officers. This was after his community started fishing for lobster ahead of the start to the federally regulated season. The band says a 1999 Supreme Court of Canada decision that affirmed their treaty rights to fish allows them to harvest lobster when and where they want. A spokeswoman for the department says federal officers pulled traps for a variety of reasons, including for improper and unauthorized tags. A family-owned Ontario company is buying Toys R Us and Babies R Us Canada from affiliates of Fairfax Financial Holdings. Doug Putnam of Putnam Investments says he believes the stores need to get more fun and become more of an experience for kids. All right, stay with us. As Canadian military forces work hard to evacuate Afghan interpreters and families, concern is growing for the safety of those left behind. We speak with Reyhana Patel, Head of Communications and Government Relations at Islamic Relief Canada up next. That and, of course, more stories from around the world on Forum Daily, so stay tuned. We'll be right back. Hundreds of Western nationals and Afghan workers have been flown to safety since the Taliban reasserted control over Afghanistan. Still unprotected and in hiding are untold numbers of Afghans who tried to build a fledgling democracy. They include Afghans who worked with foreign forces and who are now stranded and being hunted by the Taliban along with aid workers. European countries have pledged to evacuate people who are at risk, such as feminists, political activists, and journalists. But it is unclear where the line is being drawn and how many Western nations will be able to evacuate. Liberal leader Justin Trudeau says military assets and personnel are in Kabul to help evacuees aboard 2 C-17 military aircraft, making regular flights in and out of the capital. Well, joining us now to give us an idea of what's happening on the ground is Ms. Reyhana Patel, Head of Communications and Government Relations at Islamic Relief Canada. Ma'am, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me today.
Now, many of our viewers have seen the crowds and heartbreaking scenes outside the Kabul airport. Can you give us a glimpse of the situation on the ground in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so Islamic Relief, we've been working in Afghanistan over the last 20 years now as an international NGO, and the majority of our staff on the ground are local Afghans. And what we're hearing, what we're seeing on the ground is that there is that fear of the unknown and the uncertainty. And we are seeing people trying to leave the country via Kabul airport. As you can see from the images, there's not enough flights, so people are just living out in the open. What we're also not seeing, though, is the humanitarian situation that's quickly escalating. So even before all of this, 14 million Afghans were facing food insecurity. And it's only getting worse. You know, there's imports and exports out of cities and provinces have been halted. A lot of places have been closed. There's no movement. So the food insecurity is just going to increase, and the humanitarian situation is just going to escalate as the days go by.
Meanwhile, we hear the UN threat assessment reportedly warning that the Taliban is carrying out door-to-door manhunts for people who aided Western forces. Ma'am, how will this impact the thousands of people who are already displaced in Afghanistan?
So there's a lot of information that's coming out of Afghanistan. I can't confirm if that UN threat assessment is true or not. I can't say that at this point. But what I can say, though, is that the amount of people that are fleeing, that have come to Kabul to try to get out of the country, it's not enough for people. There's not enough planes to go out. And so what we're seeing is a lot of people are just living out in the open. They're unable to go back because technically they've used a lot of their savings, they've used a lot of their money, and they're kind of living in places where there's no water, electricity, shelter. Some are staying with family and friends, but some aren't. And in a lot of those open spaces are women and girls, and they're very, very vulnerable at this point. It's not a safe HQ. And until they can either get out or go back to their homes, they're going to be stranded there.
And considering women and girls, there are calls from women's rights activists who are concerned about the safety and freedoms of women under the Taliban rule. So can we get into how the Taliban have treated women in particular in the past? And should we expect anything different now that they're promising to have more freedoms for women moving forward?
Yeah, so we have seen in the last few days or so that the Taliban, that under their leadership, they're promising to respect women's rights and honor them through the limits of Islam. What that looks like, we don't know yet. I suspect there may be differing opinions within the Taliban about women. But what I can say this is that as a Muslim woman, denying an education to girls and women, violence against women and girls is completely unacceptable in Islam. And I just want your viewers to know that. And I hope that the Taliban will respect the women's rights within Islam.
All right, ma'am, just about a minute and a half left here, but let's get into Islamic Relief Canada in particular. What kind of services does your organization provide in Afghanistan, considering that it's been helping in the country for over 20 years now?
Yeah, so we've been there for quite a long time. And over the years, we've done a number of projects around water, shelter, healthcare, food insecurity, and poverty. We've also done some programs on drug rehab. The most pressing issue, though, right now is, and has been for the last few years, has been poverty. And over 30 million Afghans live below the poverty line, and food insecurity, as I mentioned before. And I can only foresee this escalating as the weeks and months go by. And as a Canadian NGO, and I urge all Canadians that the need will be there, and we must act now in order to make sure that we can provide the much needed aid to Afghans.
All right, ma'am, 30 seconds left. But what can Canadian viewers do to help those in Afghanistan, ma'am?
So there are a lot of Canadian NGOs and a lot of Canadian organizations on the ground in Afghanistan. And, if Canadians want to help, I would urge people to contact those organizations, see what they're doing, see ways you can get involved and ultimately donate and also see what you can do here. The Canadian government says that they're going to be bringing in over 20,000 Afghan refugees. So if there may be ways to get involved in the resettlement programs as well.
All right, Ms. Patel, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you. I hope that was great. Hope that was okay.
Take care, everyone. We'll be right back. The fight against wildfires across British Columbia is beginning to take its toll on the men and women on the front lines. BC Wildfire Service Operations Manager Todd Nessman says they are seeing fatigue slip in, with more trips, falls, and other serious incidents being reported. More than 8,500 square kilometers of land has burnt since the fire season started on April 1st. A BC COVID-19 modeling group is warning that daily cases could spike above 10,000 per day if no action is taken against the highly transmissible Delta variant. The group says in a new report that hospitalizations are expected to rise as the province moves into the fall. It adds that if that happened, BC's hospitals would suffer widespread bed shortages. The group also forecasts a wave of COVID-19 cases linked to the rise in the Delta variant cases among children and youth. Alberta has recorded 817 new cases of COVID-19, marking the province's highest daily count since mid-May. There are currently 6,367 active cases in the province, with the highest number in the Calgary area. Officials also note that 4 more deaths have been recorded, boosting the total number of COVID-19 deaths in Alberta up to 2,342 since the pandemic began. The University of Winnipeg, University of Manitoba, and Red River College are making COVID-19 vaccinations mandatory on their campuses this fall. A recent survey of University of Winnipeg staff and students shows nearly 80% of faculty and 72% of students support a vaccination mandate. The University of Manitoba says it will work with people who cannot be vaccinated for medical reasons and those who request a compromise on their grounds. Manitoba's Advocate for Children and Youth has released a report that says substance use, mental health issues, poverty, and violence top the list of challenges young people face. Nearly 80% of youth who've participated identified the need for more mental health and addiction services in Manitoba. They also want more community-based recreation activities and improved access to sexual health programs, schools, affordable housing, and public transportation. One of 2 unvaccinated Tory MPPs has been booted from the Progressive Conservative Caucus over his decision not to get immunized against COVID-19. Rick Nichols, who represents Chatham-Kent-Leamington at Queen's Park, says he made a personal choice about the vaccine. He says he won't be coerced into getting the shot despite being given a 5 p.m. Friday deadline to do so. The other unvaccinated legislator, Christina Mitas, who represents Scarborough Centre, has been allowed to stay in caucus because she has a letter from her doctor granting her a medical exemption. The union that represents Toronto transit workers is opposing the city's decision to mandate vaccines for city workers. Carlos Santos, the president of Amalgamated Transit Union Local 113, says he's concerned by the announcement. He says there's a lack of clarity around alternatives to vaccination and what will happen to workers who refuse to get the shot. Mr. Santos says the union supports members' rights to make their own decisions about their personal health. The Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs and the Montreal Holocaust Museum are denouncing protesters who wore yellow stars at a demonstration against Quebec's vaccine passport system. Jews were forced to wear a yellow star on their clothing in Nazi-occupied Europe. CIGA Vice President Etta Yudin says comparing the yellow star with the vaccine passport is deeply offensive to those who were forced to wear the star during the Second World War. Environmental experts are praising Montreal's decision to ban some types of single-use plastics. But they say Canada is still a long way from being plastic-free, despite government promises. Montreal Mayor Valérie Plante has announced the city would ban the distribution of plastic bags by retailers and restaurants by the end of August 2022. Police in Halifax say they have arrested 24 people after a protest broke out following a police operation to remove encampments across the city. Chief Dan Kinsella says those arrested yesterday were charged with offenses including resisting arrest, mischief, obstruction, and assaulting officers. He says the operation was organized after police received several complaints of theft, indecent acts, and domestic disputes from residents who live near the encampments. Walmart Canada has broken ground on its first distribution centre in Atlantic Canada. The 223,000 square foot facility being built in Moncton, New Brunswick is slated to open in fall 2022. This project will create more than 200 jobs in Moncton and surrounding communities. This includes more than 100 jobs inside the distribution centre. The company is spending over $56 million on the project. All right, up next, a look at top headlines from around the world as the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan is impacting United States Vice President Kamala Harris's tour of Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, Uganda suspends over 50 civil society groups. We'll have these stories and more coming up next on the Forum Daily, so stay tuned. We'll be right back with some messages from our sponsors. The Taliban takeover of Afghanistan is giving new urgency to Vice President Kamala Harris's tour of Southeast Asia. This is where she will attempt to reassure allies of American resolve following the chaotic end of a two-decade war. But there are risks. Her swing through Vietnam could draw unwanted comparisons between the withdrawal of U.S. troops there in 1975 and the effort this week to evacuate Americans and allies from Afghanistan. Amnesty International says Taliban fighters recently tortured and killed members of an ethnic minority in Afghanistan. This is fueling fears that they will again impose a brutal rule. The report comes as the Taliban have sought to project moderation and have pledged to restore security and forgive those who fought them in the 20 years since a U.S.-led invasion. But many Afghans are still skeptical. Now, the last time the Taliban was in power in Afghanistan, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube were not the powerful forces they are today. Now, the American social media companies are trying to figure out how to deal with a violent extremist group that's poised to rule an entire country of 40 million people. Experts say the companies may soon face a number of uncomfortable decisions. Meanwhile, federal regulators in the U.S. are sharpening their antitrust attack against Facebook. They have filed a revised version of their complaint, alleging the social media giant has abused its market power to suppress competition. It's the second attempt by the U.S. Federal Trade Commission after a judge dismissed antitrust lawsuits in June. Ugandan authorities have suspended more than 50 civic groups for allegedly not complying with regulations. This is dealing a blow to hundreds of thousands of people who benefit from the organization's activities. The suspensions, targeting agencies ranging from rights watchdogs to women's groups, were announced Friday by the government's Non-Governmental Organization Bureau. The government's action will renew fears of an assault on civil society that grew before a charged presidential election earlier this year. China is tightening control over data gathered by companies about the public. The data protection law expands the ruling Communist Party's crackdown on internet industries. It also follows anti-monopoly and other enforcement actions against companies, including e-commerce giant Alibaba and games and social media operator Tencent, that caused their share prices to plunge. The law takes effect November 1st and follows complaints that companies misused or sold customer data without their knowledge or permission. A radio journalist was shot to death on Thursday in the Mexican Gulf Coast state of Veracruz. The Press Freedom Organization, Article 19, says Jacinto Romero Flores has been threatened or had been threatened. The State Commission for Attention to and Protection of Journalists condemned the killing and called on the state prosecutor's office to open a full investigation. Mali's military says gunmen have ambushed an army convoy, killing at least 15 soldiers. The army announced on its Twitter account that the army vehicles came under attack on Thursday in central Mali. A vehicle exploded as it passed the convoy, and intense gunfire followed, according to the army statement. The attack has not been claimed, but bears the mark of armed groups linked to al-Qaeda that are active in the region. A lockdown in Australia's largest city has been extended through next month. Tougher measures to curb the COVID-19 Delta variant have been imposed, including a curfew and a mask mandate outdoors. Sydney has been locked down since late June. Bangladesh is suffering through its deadliest surge of the pandemic, but it has allowed businesses to reopen. This comes following weeks of strict measures put in place following the arrival of the COVID-19 Delta variant. The move has alarmed health experts, but those in favor of reopening say the risks of staying closed are even greater, including pushing tens of millions of people back into poverty. Toyota is scaling its production back 40%, affecting 14 auto assembly plants in Japan as the surging pandemic in Southeast Asia reduces supplies. Japan's top automaker says production will halt completely next month at some plants and partly at other plants. 7 years after Boko Haram extremists abducted more than 270 schoolgirls in northeast Nigeria, 2 have returned home this month. They were part of the over 100 schoolgirls still being held by the extremists. This is renewing the hope of some parents who had all but given up on the long-awaited return of their children. And Congo's child miners are swapping hammers for books as a result of the country's initiative to provide free primary education. Started in 2019, the initiative has greatly increased the number of students in schools, with the primary school in Kapushi seeing an enrollment increase of 75%. The latest figures from UNICEF have shown that almost 6 million children were out of school in 2018, decreasing to only 2 million, according to their education ministry. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always follow us on social media or visit our website. Take care, Canada. Have a great weekend.